When can we start planting across Indiana? I'm 13 News meteorologist Matt Standridge. Let's take a look at some of the average final frost and freeze dates across the state. But first, before we really get into the nitty-gritty of those, let's talk a little bit about the differences between a frost and a freeze. It has to do with the temperature, of course. Frosts are usually between 32 degrees to about 36 degrees, so you're close to freezing. The reason why frosts may, most of the time, be okay is when you have your plant, maybe a bloom or a tropical plant, something that's more sensitive. A frost usually is freezing the water on the outside of the plant. Maybe it could cause a little bit of damage, but most times the plant will be okay. And with a frost, a lot of times the temperature is not cold enough for a long enough amount of time to really do much. A freeze, though, is once you get below that 32 degree mark, and then we have something what's called a hard or a killing freeze. That's under 28 degrees. There's two reasons why those are more impactful. First off, it's just colder. We'll talk about that in a moment. Second off, you're colder for a longer period because the farther you are below 32, the longer it's going to take for you to get back above the 32 degree mark. But for a freeze, it's not just the water on the outside of the plant, it's the water on the inside of the plant that starts to freeze, and once you get freezing to take place, the ice, expands, and so you disrupt and you can really damage the vascular system inside of a plant. Some folks have seen, those frost blooms, those frost flowers that we get in the fall. That's literally the water just kind of bursting out and forming its own ice. But here in the spring, we're starting to get water flow back into the plant, into the leaves as it's trying to grow some of these new plants or tropical plant. And you don't want that water on the inside of the plant to freeze, or else it can bust and then you damage the plant. Another thing we wanted to touch on before we get into some of these dates is the difference between temperatures at a couple different feet above the ground. The air temperature actually varies quite a bit from where we stand, 5, 6, 7 feet above our heads or so, to right above the ground. Let's say, for example, you're looking at a temperature map. It says your town is at 33 degrees. Well, that is usually registered about 5 or 6 feet above the ground when we get that official air temperature. So let's say we're at 33 degrees up here, 5 or 6 feet above the ground. Well, the ground is actually cooling off faster than the air, even 5 to 6 feet above the ground. So the air temperature right here is getting much colder. In fact, there can be a 3, 4, 5 degree temperature difference between what our air temperatures say, the observations that we get across the state at our airports, versus what the air temperature is at the ground. Some of these smaller planes, they don't care what the temperature is up there. They care what the temperature is down here, and it can be a lot colder. So when we're taking a look at some of these temperatures, we really want to focus on the temperature that is a little bit closer to the ground. So we're kind of calculating that in. Now, when we're looking at these average last hard freeze dates and frost dates, we're really counting for the above temperature, because you can even be temporarily at 29 and 30 for a couple hours, and it's not really going to disrupt the plant. But it's when that temperature down below is, 25, 26 or something, that's what we're really accounting for. But for all these maps, we're going to go with the temperature above our heads, 5 to 6 feet up. So we're going to go kind of chronologically. We're going to start with hard freezes, which is the worst, and then a freeze, a little bit better, kind of a light freeze, and then we get into frost, which is kind of the last step before we are totally okay when it comes to plants. So last hard freezes, you got a couple different colors here. Towards southern Indiana, mid-March is when we typically have that last hard freeze, or what we call a killing freeze. That's when that air temperature here above our heads is 28 degrees or colder, which means the ground temperatures could be 24 degrees or colder. So that's a really hard freeze, and that's what we really want to be on the lookout for. But we think a lot of times, it's mid-March, late March, all the way through April for the state. So kind of the southern half of the state, a little bit more into March, and once you get to Indy and north, we have early April and the mid-April. But it's not just about your latitude, although that's a lot of it. It's also about the topography. So we've got a lot more hills and some valleys as you go towards kind of the Bloomington area and then French Lick. And so that helps get some colder air there in the morning. You kind of trap some of the colder air, and so that's why you see that big dip right through French Lick and West Baden Springs. And then into eastern Indiana, we kind of have some dips too. We've got Brookville Lake and got some of the valleys there, so that can make it difficult too. Then we get into northern Indiana, right here northwest Indiana, where you've got the wind farm there north of Lafayette all the way south to about Crawfordsville or so. we are wide open plains and we can get cold, especially when the wind stops blowing. You can really watch those temperatures drop. But then notice there's this little pocket where it's lightly warmer by the lakeside, because once we get into spring, the lake ice is gone. We're in the 40s or so for some of our lake water temperatures, and that actually protects parts of Valpo, Chesterton, LaPorte, they're closer to the Indiana dunes. So last hard freeze dates, if you want the official date, we have it on our website right now. In fact, we have a county by county guide across the entire state. Sometimes it's kind of hard to exactly get your pinpoint location, so we have all those for you on WTHR.com. Then we move to the last freeze. So instead of 28 and below, now we're 28 to 32 degrees for that air temperature that's right by our heads. And so that would mean you're more like 26, 27 degrees there by the ground. So that's still a pretty good freeze, but we might classify it as just normal freeze or a light freeze. We usually have to wait there until April. Once we can clear April, our freezes are usually done. Now, it's not a killing freeze, but these freezes can also be pretty damaging too. You start to disrupt that vascular system. You may not completely bust it like a killing freeze would do, but you could definitely damage the inside wall of some of those cells inside of the plant. Much of the state from Indy to the north, there towards late April. You almost got to wait till May. You know, a lot of folks say Mother's Day is a good day to wait. That's what a lot of Hoosiers have been saying for decades, lots and lots of decades. But you can get lucky. You don't always have to wait to there towards Mother's Day, which is the second Sunday in May. Sometimes you can get a little bit lucky. Then we get to frost. So frost, usually not too bad. You can maybe damage the plant just a little bit, especially on the outside of the plant, not so much on the inside, because most of the water here in a frost is just freezing the outside. Frost can last all the way through mid-May, especially for parts of northeastern Indiana. But for most of the state, right there at the transition of April into May is when we typically get our last frost. What's going to happen this year? Who knows? It's really talking about every single system passing on by. When we're talking about these average dates, we're taking a look at the past 30 years, but there are some times where we've had to wait a lot longer, and there's some years we're done in March and we didn't have to worry. Now, it's hard to know that in retrospect, right? When you're you go into your box store or a local hardware store or a local nursery, you get excited this time of year and you want to start planning. Sometimes you'll get lucky, sometimes you won't. It's a gamble. We can look at some average frost dates and freeze dates to kind of give us a closer idea. But for a lot of Hoosiers, we wait until Mother's Day to be completely safe. But hey, sometimes you win if you gamble, if you wait just past Easter. But also Easter is tricky too, because sometimes Easter's in March. That's probably a little too early. But for some of our later Easters, you might be okay. So we've got our last frost and freeze dates all across the state, county by county, on our website, WTHR.com. Thanks for joining me. Happy planning.